going to talk today about effective test automation in DevOps, and this morning Robert did me a big favor. I usually get on my soapbox, which would have put me way over 30 minutes, and talk about what test automation is and isn't. What it isn't, it's not the testing, right? You're not automating the testing. So if you're a tester, you shouldn't be scared by automation, unless your only job is maybe executing test cases that someone else wrote and marking pass or fail. But that's not testing, right? So we're going to talk about what test automation is, and I'll do my best to get within 30 minutes before I get kicked off. Don't have time to talk about me. I've been doing this a long time, 25 plus years. Some people think I know things. My wife knows better. So we'll go on. We're going to talk about importance of testing in DevOps, and of course, importance of automation in DevOps very briefly. Then some anti-patterns that cause a lot of people to run into some big troubles. We had a stat in the last talk about 75% of the transformations fail. There's a pretty well-respected stat that 80% of test automation implementations fail. So that is pretty counterproductive to what we're trying to do in DevOps. And then we'll spend most of the time talking about some techniques that we can use to bring effective test automation to your DevOps pipelines. All right, so briefly on testing. Right? I have a longer version of this talk, and I go pretty deep into what that looks like in a DevOps environment. But if we summarize it, we need fast, accurate, actionable feedback. Right? If we're putting effort into test and we're lengthening our feedback loop, but we're not getting this, what's the point? Right? And certainly not going to support our DevOps goals. From an automation perspective, I think if we take a page out of the DevOps handbook, when they talk about what's required for continuous integration, we have to have reliable automated tests, a comprehensive set of reliable automated tests, and a culture that's going to pull the emergency brake if those tests fail. All right, so if we're going to succeed with DevOps, according to these guys, and it's certainly been my experience as well, we have to have effective test automation. And it's got to be reliable. Right? If we're going to be part of that pipeline and we're going to pull the emergency brake, we're going to lose our privilege really quick of being in part of that pipeline. This looks like a familiar slide. We just saw it a couple talks ago. Another way to look at the importance of test automation is the amount of automation in high-performing, elite-performing DevOps organizations. Right? They're doing a lot more automation, not just in testing, but across all DevOps activities than their lower-performing counterparts. All right, so enough of the intro. Let's look at some common obstacles or traps that people fall into with test automation. Again, this isn't unique to DevOps. This is true for automation independent of what your development approach looks like, but absolutely required if you're trying to be successful with DevOps. So the first thing I see is too much or not enough automation. Probably more commonly too much, right? We hear about thousands of tests that are run, sometimes tens of thousands of tests that we run. But if you dig into that, there's not a whole lot of meat behind the explanation of what those tests are doing, what value they're adding. And probably what happens typically is that test suite grows over time. And no one is taking the time to understand if the tests that were there before still need to be there. Automating the wrong test, and we'll look at some techniques to understand what the right test might be. But if the tests aren't reliable, if they're not adding value, they shouldn't be part of your test suite. A big one, and we had some talk about this earlier, is only focusing on UI interaction. So I didn't come from development agile background. I came from way legacy approach to automation where everything was UI based, driven by the commercial tool vendors who told you that that big red record button was the savior for all your testing problems. So anyone that comes from that type of background, this is what they default to, right? Whether there's an API or service layer there or not, they're focused on UI automation. Should you have some UI-based automation? Of course. But if it's 100% of your testing is at that level, you're probably going down a bad path. And this is a big one we'll talk about as well, unstable test environments and data. Almost impossible to have reliable test automation without this. And finally, not treating automation as code. I'm not going to talk about this anymore, but let's suffice it to say, if we're going to rely on these automated test suites, at least in part, to assess the risk of our builds, we should be treating the code with at least the same care. All right, so let's move on to some techniques, or what I call the pillars of effective automation: scope, approach, or how we implement that test automation, and then finally environment and data management. So I'll talk about scope and approach together because they go hand in hand. First, let's take a look at a typical pipeline. As we move along that pipeline, we should be gaining confidence in the ability to deploy our build, hopefully, anyway. And similarly, those environments, as we go down the pipeline, are becoming more production-like. And therefore, those tests are likely becoming more complex. All right? So we're in this battle, though, to get faster feedback. It's this constant battle. How much risk assessment do I need before my feedback is too slow and it's counterproductive to what I'm trying to accomplish? So we're going to talk about here some techniques to understand what test suites are important, and then what tests within those test suites are important. What we like to start with is something that is called the test suite canvas. This wasn't my idea. It was first developed by Katrina Clokey. And if anyone here is interested in kind of the intricacies of what testing means in DevOps, she's got a great book. This particular version was kind of refined from the original concept by Ashley Hunsberger. I saw her present it a couple years ago. And what it is, it's a multi-perspective view of the test suites. What a lot of people do, myself included, especially a while ago, is put an automation engineer in the back room and say, okay, we need this test suite, build it. The problem is there's a lot of other factors, as we see here, that impact that. All right, and we really need to understand what they are. So this is something that is best accomplished by the team, whoever your team is, not just a single automation engineer. Understanding what the purpose of the test suite is. What are the dependencies? What needs to be in place for us to successfully implement this test suite? What constraints are going to stop us? From a pipeline execution perspective, where is this test suite going to fit in? When is it going to be run? Environment and data are huge. We'll talk about that in a second. But what environment is this test suite going to run in? How are we going to manage that, as well as the data that's there? Ownership and response, right? A test suite turns the build red. Who's responsible for figuring out what happened? Similarly, from a maintainability perspective, if we need to hand this off, for instance, what minimally needs to be in place to make that as painless as possible? And finally, effectiveness. There's a reason we're building a particular test suite, or we're implementing it. How do we know it's still giving the value that we're hoping to get from it? So once we do this for all our test suites, we'll typically put them on a spreadsheet or something similar so we can see the universe of test suites that we're thinking of implementing in our pipeline. Also helpful then, once we've decided which ones are still important, to map those against our pipeline. Helps us understand which suites can be run in parallel, which must be run ones must be run sequentially. Also give us a good idea of what environments they might run in. And now the whole team understands, in a visual sense, where our validations are as we progress. All right. A big struggle that I certainly have, and I see other teams have, is understanding what tests should be in a test suite. I like to use an acronym that was developed by Bas Dijkstra out of the Netherlands. to help me understand that, and it's FITR. Focused, informative, trustworthy, and repeatable. Focused alludes a little bit to the test automation pyramid. It's testing the code as close, or testing the functionality as close to the code that implements it as possible. A good example that I like to use, let's say we're testing an API that does a tax calculation. And if I write a test that asserts that a total on an invoice field has a certain value, and that assertion passes, I probably am okay. Not certainly okay, but probably okay. However, if that fails, I've got a long, prolonged analysis ahead of me, because there are hundreds of things potentially that could have caused that value to be different. One of them could be that tax calculation was incorrect from that API. And the flip side of that, of course, had I tested the API directly, I would probably know exactly what the problem was. Right? So it's not just that the UI testing is the slowest, most unreliable form of automation, sometimes necessary, but slowest, most unreliable. It's that if I'm testing at the right layer, it's much more focused. And also, the second point, much more informative. If your tests are focused, they're likely going to be pretty informative. But we can do more, I think. If your tests are implemented in code, someone reading that code should understand the intent of the test. Because at some point, that test is going to have to be maintained. And if they're not informative, again, we're lengthening the time that it takes to maintain the tests, or we're doing it wrong because we don't understand the original intent in the first place, and we might even lose that. On the flip side, on the output, it's also very important to be very informative. Let's say I have a UI test, and I'm trying to, I have an issue. I can't identify an element. 9 times out of 10, when someone implements that, I'll see a stack trace. That's probably okay for the person that wrote it. But what I'd like to see is what element was I going for, what locator was I using, and probably a screenshot. And 9 times out of 10 or more, that's enough for me to understand very clearly what happened. Trustworthy. The tests need to execute reliably, right? Flaky tests, unreliable tests, false positives, that all leads to long, again, prolonged analysis of what went wrong. And this points to the importance of a feedback loop. Right? I took that particular slide out of this, but part of this process needs to be a constant feedback loop into your test suite itself. Is this test still necessary? Does it need to be fixed? Should it be removed? Does it need to be adjusted? Whatever the case might be. Finally, repeatable. Right? These test suites are going to be part of a pipeline. You're not going to be pressing play like the old days. So if they're going to be kicked off automatically, they need to be ready to go on demand. And we're going to talk about this next, but it really means that you've taken care of business from an environment and a data perspective. All right. All right. So, environment and data. According to the World Quality Report, the availability of stable test environments and data is one of the top challenges with automation. It has been for a long time. And what it results in is the dreaded, well, it worked on my machine, especially if where that failure occurred was somewhere different than where that test was developed, or where the code was developed. Right? So we're going to talk about some techniques in the next couple slides to help us hopefully remove this, remove this phrase from our vernacular. First thing I want to do is take a look at the spectrum of test environments and data that we might be seeing. On the far left, we have the tried and true static, shared, and stale environments, right? We've got environments that have been around forever, so the data is probably stale. They're shared. We're running different types of tests in there, maybe UAT tests, maybe even, heck, the training department is using the environment because theirs doesn't work. You can never count on data being what you need it to be. And that's very automation averse, right? We have unreliable execution. To get around that, maybe we have long, complex data set up, and that's counterproductive to our fast feedback that we're looking for. Likely false positives, right? And again, that prolonged analysis that we should be avoiding at all costs. It's completely unnecessary. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got dynamic, dedicated, fresh environments. We've got a lot of great DevOps technologies that can promote this, right? And much more automation friendly. We can create clean environments on demand if we want. We can dedicate environments to specific test suites. We're not trying to do functional testing, load testing, and security testing all in the same environment and hope we're not stepping on each other's toes. It could be production-like if necessary, or at least we could all be working on identical but separate environments and go a long way to the, well, it worked on my machine issue. And of course, since we're building environments on demand, perhaps we could load them with clean and fresh data at the same time. So we've got a lot of, we want to move from the stale, shared, static environment to more dynamic, dedicated, fresh to support automation. Trying to run any type of automation, you could be the best framework developer, do the best job of getting the right test in your test suites. If you're dealing with what's over on the far left, it's probably not going to matter at all. Similar to environments, I want to dig a little bit deeper into test data challenges. Again, a couple years ago, the World Quality Report came out with the 3 top data challenges. And what it boils down to is the data that the tests need, the data that the tests expect in terms of response from the system, it's not there. And it all boils down to an inability to run your test suites on demand. That wasn't such a bad thing, right? When we had 6-month development cycle and we had 2 months to run regression tests, we could figure it out because we had that big window. We were still late, but it didn't look as bad. But if you're doing multiple deployments a day and your test can't run reliably, it's not going to happen. So let's take a look at what we can do about it. We need to have a strategy for managing our data. And there's no magic one-size-fits-all recipe, right? We first need to assess, well, what are we trying to do? What's the situation we have with respect to data? So here's some key questions you need to ask yourself before you can put a strategy together. First of all, what data do I require? And I have a bad habit of this, right? You create a test and almost subconsciously that data becomes part of the test. You're not thinking about, well, what's going to happen to this data tomorrow, next week, next month? So you have to identify the data that's part of your test first. And then you need to understand the dimensions of that data, right? These 5 attributes. What type of data is it? Is it in a relational database? Is it some type of marketing data feed that's coming in from a service? You need to understand what that looks like. Of course, what value, right? What value do I require? It could be a specific value or it could be a class of values. Time is a big one, right? We've all had the situation, we've had a test suite, we've had tests that have run for a period of time and then they just stopped running. They stopped working. Probably because some data expired. Could be something like credentials, passwords expired. It could be something more functional, like an insurance policy expired. Reuse. Can you reuse the data more than once? If I'm testing an e-commerce system, I probably can use an account more than once. If I'm testing shipping an order, I probably can't ship that order more than once. So you have to think about that ahead of time, not when you're, again, turning the build red because your data is out of sync. Finally, volume. almost always comes into play for multi-user testing, load testing, right? You've got some number of user accounts you've got to spread across your concurrent users, but there's some subtleties as well. Value could represent volume. In order to run a test, maybe you need a certain amount of inventory or a certain amount of credit to get your testing done. Right? You need to understand this if you're going to manage it. And then finally, you need to know where your data lives. What's the source? Again, if you're going to manage it, it may be owned by someone else. It may be in a separate environment. It may need to be pulled from somewhere. You need to understand what that is if you're going to have any hope of managing it. How are we doing? We're doing okay. Again, there's not one size fits all data management strategy. Even two organizations implementing the same system, maybe the same ERP system, their strategies are going to be different. Right? Their environments are going to be different, how they're organized are going to be different, and that's all going to impact how you control your data. But there's some things we can do. There's some things at the system application level that we can do. We have the tried and true refresh. Doesn't work so good in today's distributed systems, integrated systems, especially in fast-moving environments. But perhaps we can do things like data partitioning. We can dedicate certain data values to certain test suites. Maybe we have a warehouse management system. We've dedicated a warehouse only for a particular test suite or a certain set of accounts. We can have dedicated automation environments, especially if we have the ability to create fresh, dynamic environments. That's very possible. Also, some things we can do at the test suite level. Right? We can do some pre-test data setup, some post-test cleanup, perhaps. Again, if our tests run for 15 minutes and our cleanup or our teardown run for an hour, that's probably not a good spot. But in combination with other techniques, that's important. We talked about creating environments on demand. Also can build some things into our test suite. So for instance, we'll typically, instead of if we know we have dynamic data, right? We looked at the dimensions, we know we have dynamic data, we won't put data values into our tests. We'll put static placeholders into our tests. And then build into our framework the capability to replace those static placeholders with whatever the current value is at the time. And those current values will be in some central repository somewhere. And we'll let the test suite handle that at runtime for us. It saves us a lot of maintenance as those values change. I'm not looking through all my tests to figure out what I need to change. I'm just changing it in one place. Of course, we have external techniques as well. Right? We have full-blown commercial test data management systems. I don't see those that often in anything but the largest enterprises because they're particularly expensive. But we also have mocking and service virtualization that can help us address some data issues, especially upstream in the pipeline. All right, let's wrap up here. Some key takeaways. You're going to need effective automation if you're going to succeed in DevOps, right? You have to have that fast feedback. You could have the best testers in the world, critical thinkers, exploratory, but there's going to be a lot of automated checks, a lot of checks that can be executed every time, and you're not going to be able to scale. You're not going to be able to accelerate. Make sure you're creating the right test suites. Think about that up front. Right? A lot of times this happens organically. Right? We think about the development and the operations side of this, but we don't think about how we're going to insert our automated validations, our risk assessments. Think about that up front. Have to understand your test environments and your data. You have to. Again, it doesn't matter if you've done everything else correct. If you don't control your environments and data, you're not going to be effective. And you want a continuous feedback loop in this entire process. Right? The tests are going to get old, they're going to get stale, and if you're going to keep that feedback loop at a minimum, you want to make sure you don't have any undervalued tests, or I'm sorry, tests that are not providing value, tests that are flaky, tests that are unreliable. Just going to cause you a bigger headache in the long run. And finally, and I think most important, we didn't talk about specific tools, especially from an automation perspective. We've got a few minutes. That's probably the biggest mistake I see people make from an automation perspective. Someone comes to a project and they've used Selenium in the past, or some commercial tool, or some library, and that is their hammer. And every automation opportunity that they see in this new project becomes a nail. And it just takes them down a bad path. That whole process of understanding what test suites are important, what tests are important within those test suites, it gets bypassed because someone comes in with their hammer and just starts hitting everything. So before you think about your tooling, especially from a test automation perspective, make sure you've taken care of business for all those other things that we talked about earlier. All right. If there's any questions, I'm happy to always talk about this stuff. You can hit me up at any of those addresses there, and feel free, even if just a sounding board. So thank you.